Now we will continue the Community Economic Development Committee, which is chaired by April Barker.
Thank you, Pinky. I'm joined today with Council Members Michael and Terry. We have a work session on closed captioning and local options. Let's see, the summary statement here is that in 2014 and 15, oh, that's the water main, my apologies. On March 7, 2016 council meeting, the Bellingham City Council requested that staff provide a briefing on local options to increase the availability of television closed caption at local public facilities. The attached memo discusses some efforts elsewhere to improve the availability of closed captioning and also some preliminary estimate costs for adding closed captioning to City Council broadcasts. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark Gardner, our City Council Legislative Analysis.
Good afternoon. This topic was requested by the Council last month, and there's a memo in your packet that summarizes a brief overview of how closed captioning came about technologically, how it is required to be provided by various entities, and some local efforts to increase availability of closed captioning. So just to briefly go over some of the high points, the technology for closed captioning has been around since the 1970s, and text is encoded within a video and is retranslated and then displayed on a text, either indicating spoken words or sounds within the video display of that particular transmission or broadcast. And there's been various federal requirements for closed captioning that have been enacted since the 1990s. In many cases, it took many years for these to be rolled out in terms of regulations, and there were phased implementations, so it's somewhat complicated, but they're mostly fully implemented now. And amongst the first changes were that analog receivers, meaning the old fat televisions, should be able to render or receive and translate closed captioning. This was later expanded to include digital displays. Then there was a series of requirements that certain broadcasters or content providers produce closed captioning that can be either transmitted or otherwise sent and then decoded at the user end. So those are the general federal requirements for this issue. In terms of the creation of closed captioning, it's not something that at current times and technologies can be done just using a computer. That was one thing I learned researching this, that it requires human intervention to do it right. Generally, there's 2 or 3 different ways it can be done, or a combination of ways, but it requires a trained transcriptionist who does the translation either in live terms or works off a script, or basically works off a specific stenography device, which then overlays the caption on the video or otherwise other form of content. And because of the work involved, closed captioning can be costly, and this is a major factor in who is required by the federal government to provide closed captioning and who is not. In general, larger organizations with larger budgets are required to provide captioning, but there is a series of exceptions. For example, for smaller stations, content for short-term use, programs aired late at night, for instructional programming, for K-12 schools, and for government and educational and public access content. So in general, the larger you are, the more money you have, the more you're likely to be required to provide this content. But just wanted to note that because of these exemptions, closed captioning may not be available even when a receiver is set to display it. There are some federal requirements for displaying or enabling closed captions. These exist to include airports, hospitals, and some lodging establishments, for example. And in terms of localities, 3 state or local governments have enacted requirements for displaying or enabling the viewing of closed captions. San Francisco and Portland require closed captioning to be turned on when a particular video receiver or television is turned on, whereas the state of Maryland requires captioning to be turned on upon the request of a patron at various establishments open to the public. And there was also some questions about closed captioning on BTV10, and the staff of BTV10 looked into some of the early estimates. And what we know now is that although BTV10 is currently exempt, estimates are that it would cost an estimated $30,000 for the first year to set up closed captioning capacity for city council meetings, and approximately $15,000 after that to do full committee meetings, and additional meetings would be additional dollar requirements. And we've got the full complement of BTV10 staff here in the room, so if you have any questions about our local research on BTV10, they can probably help you with that. In general, that's the overview I wanted to provide, and see how you might want to proceed with this topic.
Thank you, Mark. Is there any discussion? Roxanne.
I was just wondering if another thing that we could potentially explore is regularly having an ASL interpreter for our meetings, because that could be more cost effective.
Anybody else? Okay, so I sent this out to, that we were going to be having this discussion today. Chambers of Commerce, Bellingham School District, the hospitality group that meets with the Campus Coalition, Deaf and Hard of Hearing community, as well as the Downtown Partnership, and I really got very little feedback. So I wonder if the council is interested, we could open this up for, it's beyond a work session. It's a public comment versus a public hearing. Those are two different things, right? Is anybody interested in pursuing it further before we decide on an ordinance, or if we're going to move further on it? Pinky?
I was just going to say that maybe we could bring this into our level of service discussion, because all of these things are, but I think budget seems to be our biggest question here, and maybe we could bring that into the level of service discussion. Would that make sense? I'm going to kind of ask the mayor here.
Since you're looking at me, I will answer.
Thank you.
At the point that we are now in our level of service, we're talking about holding the level of service until we either prioritize, cut things, or figure out a different way to fund different things. So I guess what I'd prefer is if we had it part of the level of service discussion, so if it becomes a priority for the council members, we can use that information to prioritize the rest of the budget before we make the recommendations, because I think it is a new program that we haven't provided right now. And for your information, I just asked Matt, a public hearing is a requirement. Public comment is not, but they're both basically the same thing.
Similar. Well, and I think it's important to note that the community members that spurred this discussion that came forward, although I do appreciate Mark's comprehensive outlook, was simply asking if we would consider an ordinance that would require hospitality industry that's open to the public to require them to have the closed captioning on, not so much having BTV 10 suffer the cost of that. So I think that as far as this group's concerned at this point would be, do we want to pursue ordinance language or have a further comment? Terry?
I think before I would consider asking whether we're going to want a public hearing, I'd want to know what kind of ordinance somebody might be considering. If we are considering an ordinance that requires hospitality providers to do this, then I would say yes, we very much want a public hearing. This has been out here and for public comment already. I've gotten it from different people that different restaurants and got input about this. And particularly, one of the things that I had heard from some that do have television screens on is looking at what ADA was about, and that was for equal access. So when you have many restaurants or bars that have televisions on but don't have sound, And many of them in sports bars, that's the way it is. There is no sound. So basically, everyone has equal access under the law, under the ADA standing, because there is no sound going out from that. And the question came, well, why would, one of the reasons we don't put closed captioning is many patrons complain about that, but if somebody asks for that, we might do that. But if we don't have sound already, why should we be required to put special captions up there when we're not even displaying sound and go through the expense and the training? And so that, that was the most common one that I had heard.
Thank you for sharing your feedback. Michael?
I don't know. It's a funny issue. I never thought it'd come before us. In some ways, it's kind of simpler, I think, than we're making it. Any modern TV gets closed captioning. Any major program has closed captioning. The way to turn on closed captioning is really simple on any device. This is not a particular burden. You go into a bar, and I actually appreciate it when the closed captioning is on, even though I'm a hearing person, because I don't want the noise, and it's nice to hear the announcer, call the game, or see the announcer call the game. So I think any establishment ought to turn on closed captioning already to serve their hearing and hearing impaired clients. That said, I don't necessarily want to pass a rule or a law about just a good ordinary business practice for your customers. I mean, I'm on the other hand, it's like, well, I'm not part of the deaf community. I don't know what it's like to be cut off. So I'm really mixed. I really don't want to pass a law on this, and I really do want people to turn on their closed captioning.
Any further discussion?
Just a question, Dale. Can I turn my closed caption thing on if I'm watching a council meeting? Will it work? It won't work.
Not for us.
Okay, but pretty much every other channel does have that option with your remote, other than Channel 10. Okay.
Mayor Kelly?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say something because I think we should, and I'll be brutally honest, always lead by example. So I would feel uncomfortable telling other people that they should do something that we don't without a real good discussion about the pros and cons and the cost and everything else that goes on, because it doesn't sound like a lot to say $30,000 for our closed captioning, and maybe that's absolutely right, but it is still a new program we're considering, and I do think that if we're expecting businesses to do it, if that would be the goal, then I think that we should make that available on our TV too. And so I think it's a little bit bigger. It's a little bit bigger issue just because it's adding a new program. It's a cost to the city, and if we excuse ourselves or give ourselves an exception, we're not really treating everybody the same. So, though I like Roxanne's idea of the ASL, I never knew fast enough ESL to be able to, not ESL, American Sign Language, to be able to translate, but I could keep ahead of a few people.
Roxanne?
Yeah, I was just wondering too, just to kind of throw some more spaghetti on the wall, if it would be possible to work with our business community so they could generate a list of businesses that would be willing to turn on the closed captioning, and then we could do outreach to the community about businesses that would be willing, and hopefully get the businesses more business.
Yeah, I think that was one of the feedback that I got is it's the hospitality industry, and it might be a way where the city can maybe have a place on their webpage where they have restaurants that have said that they're willing to provide access to that type of thing. If we were to go that route versus having a public comment, do we ask you to put it to a staff member to see if there is something we could do to reach out to the community, educate the community on that?
I think if you direct us to get that information, then we can take care of it, and obviously we'd work with Mark, who has already been researching this, if that's okay with the council.
Okay, so I guess I'd make a motion that we direct the staff to look into further ways of educating the hospitality community on closed captioning, and also find a way to publicize those that are willing to provide access. And in the meantime, continue to look into closed captioning for BTV 10.
And I would say that the Maryland model of people asking
Right.
is also a good model, because
Yes.
that could happen with a hearing person or a person that's hearing impaired. So I think that kind of gives a little more flexibility to business owners who might not want to do it all the time, but would do it if somebody asked.
Yeah. Is there a second?
Yeah, we don't need,
Oh, you don't
I will
have to.
second it, but I do agree with the mayor on the Maryland model, is what I'd heard from owners and stuff, that, if people ask, and I do know from some in the deaf community feel, well, we shouldn't have to ask, but if there's no sound anyway, it does, but I think that one would work better and get much more acceptance. If we're looking at doing anything, would get much more acceptance within the hospitality industry,
Michael?
and would do it probably without passing an ordinance.
I guess I'm a little bit bothered by how the motion went, that we should go out and educate the hospitality industry. My guess is they know an awful lot already. I'd like that to be a two-way street. If we're talking to the hospitality community, staff members are, I'd like to hear kind of semi-officially from those businesses when and why and they turn on closed captioning or don't turn on closed captioning. My guess is they've thought this through, and I want to hear why they're doing the practices they're doing. It may be they haven't thought about it, or maybe they've thought about it a great deal, and that's why they always have it on, or whatever. Before we go out and start educating them, I kind of also want to make sure we're hearing from them at the same time.
So are you making a motion to have a public comment period?
No. I'm saying if we're having staff go out and talk to businesses, I think the staff members should be listening at the same time.
Yeah. I
Now,
would
we've had this
generally
issue
say
come
do that.
forward. We're considering, practices on closed captioning. What are your practices? I would start there.
Question, Mayor Kelly?
And this is one of those things we put on our list of things to do, because as you know, right now, we are developing the budget, and it would be very difficult for existing staff members to go out and be doing an activity like that at this moment in time. But that doesn't mean that we can't. And again, I'll just say, in working with Mark, look at that once we're over some of the humps of the things that we're doing now. I hate to put new things on top of the things that we have to do at that moment. So,
Roxanne?
yes.
We, as council members,
Yes.
could work with the chamber and could
Yes.
work with the downtown merchants and do listening sessions and gather information and do a lot of this, and I would love to support that.
And this was not meant to inhibit any council members from doing their own thing.
All right. Well, is there any further discussion? Okay, with that, I'm still learning, so I call an end to committee.
We've got a
But I did
motion.
make a motion, so I guess we have to vote on the motion. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All those abstaining? Okay, so we have we have a mixed recommendation and a committee.
Thank you, April. We're going to take a little break here and convene with Committee of the Whole.